There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes after spending time with people who like you. Not people who hurt you or reject you. People who genuinely enjoy your company. You leave their presence feeling strangely hollow, as if something essential was borrowed from you and never returned. And the confusing part is that nothing bad happened. The conversation was fine. They laughed. You laughed. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside, you feel like you've been running for hours. If you've ever felt this way, if you've ever wondered why connection depletes you while others seem energized by it, I want you to stay with me through this entire exploration. And if this already feels familiar, if there's a part of you recognizing itself in these words, would you let me know in the comments? Just a simple "I feel this" is enough, because what I'm about to share isn't something most people talk about openly, and knowing you're not alone in this experience might be the most important thing you take from today. Before we go further, if this kind of deep psychological exploration resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This work matters, and your presence here matters. Thank you for that. Carl Jung once wrote about the persona, the mask we wear in social situations, the version of ourselves we present to be acceptable, to be understood, to belong. For most people, wearing this mask is relatively effortless. It's a light fabric they can put on and remove without much thought. But for certain individuals, what Jung called those with a particularly receptive unconscious, the persona becomes something heavier. It's not just a mask you wear, it's a weight you carry. And the more sensitive your internal antenna, the more exhausting it becomes to maintain that mask while simultaneously absorbing everything happening beneath the surface of every interaction. This is where the empath's dilemma begins. You're not just participating in conversation, you're reading the room at a level most people don't access. You're sensing what isn't being said. You're feeling the emotional temperature shift before anyone's tone changes. You're noticing micro-expressions, energy fluctuations, the gap between someone's words and their actual state. And all of that information floods your system without permission, without pause, without an off switch. So when people ask why you have so few friends, they're asking the wrong question. The question isn't "why don't you have more friends?" The question is, how do you protect your inner world in a reality that constantly asks you to give more than you can sustainably offer? Jung understood this tension deeply. He spoke about the introverted, intuitive type, those individuals whose primary mode of perception is turned inward, receiving impressions from the collective unconscious, from the unseen realm of symbols, patterns, and energies that most people never consciously encounter. If you are this type, and you're beginning to suspect you might be, then your small circle isn't a failure. It's an adaptation. It's your psyche's way of creating the space it needs to remain intact. There's something Jung called the wounded healer archetype, and it lives in every empath whether they've named it or not. The wounded healer is someone who has been broken open by life, who has descended into their own darkness, and who emerges with a deep capacity to hold space for others' pain. But here's what most people miss about this archetype. The wound never fully closes. It remains tender, receptive, porous. And that openness, while it makes you an extraordinary presence for others, also makes you vulnerable to being flooded by emotional content that isn't even yours. You've probably noticed this. Someone tells you about their struggle, and hours later, you're still feeling it in your body. Not thinking about it, feeling it. Their anxiety becomes your tightness. Their grief becomes your heaviness. Their anger becomes your restlessness. And because you're empathic, you often don't realize where your emotions end and theirs begin. Jung called this participation mystique, a state of unconscious identification where boundaries dissolve and you merge with the emotional field around you. This is why having many friends becomes almost impossible for the deeply empathic person. It's not about preference. It's about capacity. Every relationship is an open channel, and when you have 10 channels open simultaneously, the signal becomes overwhelming. You can't process it all. You can't metabolize that much emotional information. So your psyche does the only intelligent thing it can do. It closes some channels, it withdraws, it protects. But withdrawal comes with its own pain, doesn't it? Because while you're protecting yourself, you're also watching others move through the world with apparent ease. They collect friends effortlessly. They maintain group chats and plan gatherings and seem genuinely energized by constant social contact. And you start wondering what's wrong with you. Why can't you do what seems so natural for everyone else? Nothing is wrong with you. What you're experiencing is the consequence of having a fundamentally different psychological structure. Jung described this as the difference between those who live primarily in the outer world of objects and actions, the extroverted types, and those who live primarily in the inner world of impressions and reflections, the introverted types. But even within the introverted category, there are degrees. And if you're an empath with few or no friends, you're likely operating at the far end of that spectrum, where your inner world is so rich, so complex, so demanding of attention, that the outer world of social obligation feels like an invasion. This isn't about being antisocial. It's about being self-protective in a world that doesn't understand the cost of your openness. And if you're starting to feel a kind of relief hearing this, a sense that maybe your experience has legitimacy, I'd love to know. Have you ever tried to explain this to someone and felt completely misunderstood? Drop a comment if that's ever happened to you, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Jung spent years studying what he called the individuation process, the psychological journey toward becoming your true self, separate from collective expectations and projections. And one of the most challenging aspects of this journey, particularly for empaths, is learning to differentiate between your authentic needs and the internalized voices that tell you who you should be. From a very young age, you were probably told that having many friends is important, that popularity matters, that being social is a sign of health and success. These messages came from parents, teachers, media, culture itself. And because you're empathic, you absorbed those messages deeply. You tried to comply. You showed up to gatherings. You said yes when you wanted to say no. You performed friendship even when it felt hollow, because you believed something was wrong with you for not wanting what everyone else seemed to want. But here's what Jung would tell you. The collective voice, what he called the collective unconscious, carries archetypal patterns that apply broadly to human experience. But your individual psyche has its own configuration, its own blueprint, its own requirements for wholeness. And when those two are in conflict, when what the collective says you should want contradicts what your soul actually needs, you experience profound dis-ease. This is the root of the guilt many empaths carry. You feel guilty for canceling plans, guilty for not texting back quickly, guilty for needing so much alone time, guilty for disappointing people who just want to be close to you. But that guilt isn't coming from your authentic self. It's coming from the internalized collective voice that says your natural way of being is somehow deficient. Jung believed that true psychological health isn't about conforming to external standards. It's about achieving what he called the union of opposites, the integration of all parts of yourself, including the parts that don't fit neatly into social expectations. For the empath, this means honoring both your capacity for deep connection and your need for solitude. It means accepting that you can love people deeply and still need significant distance from them. It means releasing the fantasy that you should be different than you are. One of the characteristics Jung identified in highly sensitive, introverted individuals is what he called the feeling function. Not emotion, though that's related, but a sophisticated internal value system that constantly evaluates whether something feels right or wrong, aligned or misaligned, true or false. When you have a dominant feeling function, you can't ignore your internal signals. You can't simply push through discomfort the way others might. Your body, your psyche, your entire system will rebel. So when you pull away from friendships that feel depleting, you're not being difficult. You're listening to a deeper intelligence, an intelligence that knows what you need to remain psychologically intact. And that intelligence, according to Jung, is far wiser than any external expectation could ever be. Your small circle is not a problem to be solved. It's information to be honored. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being deeply empathic, and it's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being with people and still feeling unseen. You can be in a room full of friends, contributing to the conversation, laughing at the right moments, and yet feel a profound sense of isolation. Because what's being seen is your persona, your social self, not the vast interior landscape where you actually live. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, The parts of ourselves we hide because they're unacceptable to our conscious identity or to the people around us. For empaths, one of the most persistent shadow elements is the need for depth. You hide how much you crave meaningful conversation. You hide how exhausting small talk feels. You hide how desperately you want someone to ask you a real question and then actually wait for your real answer. Why do you hide this? Because you've learned that expressing these needs makes people uncomfortable. When you try to go deeper, you're often met with deflection or humor or a quick change of subject. People aren't usually rejecting you intentionally. They're simply operating at a different depth. And over time, you learn to keep your deeper self hidden, to offer only what others can receive, to stay on the surface where everyone else seems comfortable. But here's the cost of that adaptation. Every time you hide your depth to make others comfortable, you betray yourself. You reinforce the belief that who you really are is too much, too intense, too complicated. And slowly, imperceptibly, you start to disappear from your own life. The persona becomes so thick, so convincing, that even you start to forget what's underneath. This is why friendships often feel so exhausting for empaths. You're not just managing the relationship, you're managing the gap between who you actually are and who you're pretending to be. And that gap requires enormous energy to maintain. So when you finally get home and close the door behind you, the relief you feel isn't about escaping people. It's about finally being able to drop the mask and breathe as yourself. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But for the empath, that journey often requires disappointing people, setting boundaries that feel harsh, choosing solitude over shallow connection. It requires you to stop apologizing for needing what you need. And that's terrifying, isn't it? Because what if you honor your truth and discover that no one wants to meet you there? What if your authentic self is too much for everyone? I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll reflect on this honestly, maybe even share your thoughts below. When was the last time someone asked you how you really were and meant it and waited for your answer? And when was the last time you actually told them the truth? That moment of hesitation you're feeling right now, that's the gap I'm talking about. And you're not alone in it. Jung introduced the concept of psychological types, and within his framework, he identified a particular category that feels almost prophetic when applied to empaths. He called it the introverted feeling type, individuals whose dominant function is an internal, deeply subjective evaluation of everything they encounter. These individuals don't experience the world through logic or sensory detail or external validation. They experience it through an extraordinarily refined inner sense of rightness and wrongness, harmony and discord. If you're this type, and many empaths are, you don't just notice when something feels off. You're flooded by it. A conversation that seems pleasant on the surface might leave you feeling disturbed for days because you sensed an underlying dishonesty. A friendship that looks functional from the outside might feel intolerable to you because the values don't align. You're not being picky. You're being honest about what your system can tolerate. Jung also noted that introverted feeling types are often misunderstood because their value system is largely invisible. Unlike extroverted feeling types who express their values openly and adapt to group harmony, introverted feeling types hold their values internally, privately, almost sacredly. They don't announce their moral framework, they simply live by it. And when someone violates that framework, even unintentionally, the introverted feeling type will withdraw, often without explanation. This is one of the reasons empaths end up with so few friends. You're not cutting people off because you're cold or judgmental. You're creating distance because something fundamental has been violated, and you don't know how to explain it without sounding overly sensitive or harsh. So you fade quietly, and people interpret that fading as rejection, when really it's self-preservation. Another characteristic Jung identified is the concept of psychic energy, or libido, though he used that term more broadly than Freud did. For Jung, libido is the life force that flows through all psychological activity. And he observed that for introverted types, this energy flows primarily inward, toward the inner world of thoughts, feelings, images, and reflections. Social interaction reverses that flow. It demands that you direct your energy outward, toward others, toward conversation, toward presence. This is why, after socializing, you feel so drained. You haven't just spent time with people. You've redirected your life force away from its natural inward flow and pushed it outward for an extended period. And the more empathic you are, the more energy that reversal requires, because you're not just directing energy toward conversation. You're also absorbing the emotional energy of everyone around you. You're processing their moods, their unspoken tensions, their hidden agendas. So when you come home and need hours, sometimes days, to recover, you're not being antisocial. You're allowing your energy to return to its natural direction. You're restoring balance. And if the people in your life don't understand that, if they take your need for solitude personally, it doesn't mean they're bad people. It means they're operating with a different energetic configuration, one that Jung would call extroverted, where energy is naturally restored through external contact rather than depleted by it. One of Jung's most profound contributions to psychology was his exploration of the collective unconscious, that deep stratum of the psyche that contains universal patterns, symbols, and archetypes shared across all of humanity. And here's what many people miss. Jung believed that certain individuals have more direct access to this collective unconscious than others. They're more porous to it, more receptive to its contents, more influenced by its currents. If you're deeply empathic, you're likely one of these individuals. You don't just pick up on what's happening in the room. You pick up on what's happening beneath the room, the archetypal energies, the collective anxieties, the unspoken agreements and tensions that shape human interaction. This gives you an almost psychic quality, an ability to sense things before they're articulated, to know things you have no logical reason to know. But this gift, and it is a gift, comes with a burden. Because when you're this open to the collective unconscious, you're also more vulnerable to being overwhelmed by it. You absorb not just individual emotions, but collective trauma, cultural anxiety, generational pain, and you often can't distinguish between what's yours and what belongs to the larger field. So you walk through life carrying weight that doesn't even originate with you, weight you never agreed to carry, weight that makes every social interaction feel like navigating a minefield. This is why empaths with few friends often feel simultaneously isolated and overwhelmed. You're isolated because no one understands the level at which you're experiencing reality, but you're overwhelmed because you're constantly processing information that others aren't even consciously aware of. You exist in a paradox, too alone and too full at the same time. Jung believed that people with this level of sensitivity were called to a specific task, not necessarily a professional calling, though it might manifest that way, but a psychological task. He believed these individuals were meant to serve as mediators between the conscious world and the unconscious world, between the surface of life and its depths. In traditional cultures, these were the shamans, the healers, the seers. In modern culture, these are often the artists, the therapists, the writers, anyone who translates invisible experience into something others can recognize. But whether or not you ever formalize that role, you're already living it. Every time you sense something unspoken and hold space for it, you're doing this work. Every time you choose depth over superficiality, you're honoring this calling. And every time you protect your energy by limiting your social circle, you're making space for the inner work that your psyche requires. Let me ask you something, and this might be uncomfortable to consider. What if your small circle isn't a problem at all? What if it's evidence that you're actually listening to your soul's requirements rather than conforming to external expectations? And if that question unsettles you, or if it brings unexpected relief, would you share what comes up for you? Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is name what we've been carrying silently. Jung described a process he called active imagination, a method of engaging with the unconscious by allowing images, feelings, and symbols to arise without censorship or interpretation. For empaths, something similar happens involuntarily in social situations. You're not just interacting with the person in front of you, you're interacting with their unconscious material, their shadow, their unspoken needs and fears. And that material communicates itself to you through subtle cues, through energy, through what Jung might call the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to synthesize conscious and unconscious content. This is why conversations exhaust you so deeply. You're not having one conversation, you're having multiple simultaneous conversations. There's the surface dialogue, the words being exchanged. There's the emotional undercurrent, the feelings beneath those words. There's the historical context, the baggage each person brings. And there's the archetypal dimension, the universal patterns playing out through this specific interaction. Most people are only aware of the first layer. You're processing all of them at once. And here's the complication. Because you sense so much, people often project onto you. They see you as wise, as stable, as someone who has it all figured out. Jung called these projections the unconscious attribution of one's own qualities onto another person. And empaths are frequent recipients of projection because your receptive presence creates a kind of blank screen onto which others can project their need for understanding, for validation, for healing. This feels honoring at first. People open up to you. They trust you. They tell you things they've never told anyone else. And you feel useful, needed, important. But over time, you realize that many of these connections aren't actually about you. They're about what you can do for others. And when you need support, when you reach out with your own vulnerability, people often don't know how to receive you. They're used to you being the strong one, the healer, the one who holds space. They're not equipped to reverse that dynamic. So you learn to carry your struggles alone. You learn that your role in most relationships is to give, not to receive. And slowly, you start withdrawing from those relationships, not with anger, but with clarity. You recognize that these aren't true friendships. They're service relationships. And while there's nothing wrong with serving others, it can't be the foundation of every connection in your life. Jung believed that psychological wholeness required what he called the integration of opposites. For the empath, this means learning to be both giver and receiver, both healer and wounded, both open and boundaried. It means releasing the identity of the person who's always available, always understanding, always accommodating. That identity, while noble, is incomplete. It's a persona. And true individuation requires you to include the parts of yourself that are selfish, that need rest, that say no, that choose yourself over others. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of being an empath with few friends. You're not just losing relationships. You're losing an identity that felt meaningful, and you're being asked to build something new in its place. So we arrive at the heart of it. What Jung would call the central organizing principle of your psyche, the self with a capital S, has its own wisdom. And that wisdom is telling you something important through your small circle of friends, through your need for solitude, through your inability to function in the social world the way others do. It's telling you that you're not broken. You're different. And that difference isn't a flaw to be corrected, but a design to be honored. Jung spent his entire life arguing against the pathologization of introversion, sensitivity, and depth. He insisted that these traits weren't disorders, but legitimate psychological orientations, with their own value, their own gifts, their own challenges. For you, the challenge has been living in a world that celebrates extroversion, that equates social success with personal worth, that treats solitude as something to be fixed. But what if solitude is actually where you do your most important work? What if the hours you spend alone, processing, reflecting, integrating, are as valuable as any social contribution someone else might make? What if your small circle allows for a quality of connection that broad networks can never achieve? Jung believed that modern society had lost touch with the inner world, that we'd become overly focused on external achievement, material success, social status. And he warned that this imbalance would lead to collective neurosis, a sense of emptiness despite outward success. For the empath, you're already living in rebellion against that imbalance. By honoring your need for depth, for solitude, for meaningful over plentiful connection, you're maintaining contact with something essential that the broader culture has forgotten. This doesn't make your path easier, but it does make it meaningful. And meaning, according to Jung, is what the soul craves more than happiness, more than comfort, more than acceptance. Your small circle is evidence that you're living in alignment with your soul's requirements rather than your ego's insecurities. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, if you've recognized yourself in these words, I want to thank you. Not just for watching, but for being who you are, for trusting your inner knowing, for choosing depth in a shallow world. That takes extraordinary courage. I'd love to hear your experience. What part of this resonated most deeply? What's one thing you've learned about yourself through your journey of having few close friends? Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to feel less alone. And if this exploration served you in some way, would you consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear this? Not because I need the numbers, but because this kind of understanding spreads one person at a time, through genuine connection. And finally, if you're still questioning whether your way of being is acceptable, let me leave you with Jung's words. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You're already on that path. Trust it, honor it, and know that some of us see you exactly as you are and recognize it as enough. Thank you for being here. Take good care of that beautiful, sensitive soul of yours.